I hear something saying, ah, ah, well, don't you know that's the sound of the men working on the chain.
Hi everyone, we're here for our group project for Power and Punishment. I'm Sarah Schreiner.
I'm Connor Foley.
I'm Nick Rupert.
And I'm Marc-Yves.
Our topic today is private prisons in the United States, and basically what we're going to be talking about is the history, the current events that are related to them, kind of how they work, the business that's involved with them, court cases, the pros and cons of private prisons, why they should or shouldn't exist, and at the end we'll come together to debrief a memo that we would create and present to President Trump if he were to ask us or consult us on this issue. I'd say that that's probably one of the reasons that we are discussing this topic today, is because it is a current topic that is coming to light due to the issues that are involved with private prisons and the recent changes that have happened in the stock market and the changes Obama had planned on making. So we're going to touch on a lot of that. But to start, the definition of a private prison.
So a quick definition from corrections.org. A private prison is a jail or detention center, a place in which individuals are physically confined or interned by a third party that is contracted by a local, state, or federal government agency.
So starting with the history, or after the definition, they started originally in the United Kingdom, the UK. Private jails, prisons, and detention centers in the U.S. go as far back as 1852, when San Quentin was the first for-profit prison in the United States, and that is now currently state-owned. In 1852, on the northwest San Francisco Bay in California, inmates of the private ship Waban began building a contract facility to house themselves at Point Quentin, and that prison then became known as San Quentin, which obviously exists today. So more recent resurgence of private prisons came after privatization took place in the 1980s. So today there are currently about 150 private jails, prisons, and detention centers in the U.S. from what the information we've gathered. This resurgence occurred due to President Reagan's, war on drugs, which officially started in 1971. The war on drugs increased prison population due to the minimum sentences and the increased criminalization for those smaller crimes that weren't previously criminalized. This led to overcrowding and rising costs, which became a big political issue in the United States, considering so many more people were being locked up. So the private business stepped in and offered a solution, and then began the era of privately run prisons. So they increased business-like efficiency, or they were planned to increase business-like efficiency, which would result in cost savings by the government and overall in a decrease in the amount that the government would have to spend on the prison system, while still providing that same service. So it was theorized that private prisons would be held more accountable because they could be fined or fired, unlike traditional prisons. But that is up to us to tell you whether or not that actually happened.
So kind of looking at private prisons today, there's two major private prison corporations. There's Correction Corporation of America, and they say that they house nearly 70,000 inmates in more than 70 facilities, the majority of which are company-owned, with a total bed capacity of more than 80,000. And CCA currently partners with all three federal correction agencies, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the U.S. Marshals Service, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And then the second corporation, GEO Group, GEO's U.S. Corrections and Detentions Division, oversees the operation and management of approximately 66,000 beds and 58 correctional and detention facilities, which represents the sixth largest correctional system in the United States. And then looking forward, kind of the current state of the private prison industry. It is a growing industry. Between 1990 and 2010, The number of privately operated prisons in the U.S. increased by 1,600%, and private prisons bring in roughly $3 billion in revenue every year. Over half of this comes from holding facilities for undocumented immigrants, and private prisons run over 50% of detainment facilities for immigrants. And CCA and the GEO group, they made $3.3 billion in annual revenue in 2012. These two companies do make up 75% of the prison industry. As far as cheap labor, they do make money by contracting prison labor out to private companies, which would include companies like Starbucks, Boeing, Victoria's Secret, McDonald's. And prisoners work in apparel, document conversion, call centers, printing and clean energy. And a single prisoner's labor is worth between 93 cents and $4 a day. And there are also lockup quotas, so contracts guarantee that prison occupancy rates will stay at or above a specific level. And if those occupancy rates are not fulfilled, the government must pay for those empty beds. And in contracts with the government, some private prison companies demand minimum occupancy levels of more than 0%. And as far as like the recent election and Obama and Trump, as of December 2015, more than 22,000 federal inmates, or about 12% of the total, were in private facilities. And that's according to a report in August from the Justice Department's Inspector General. And the Justice Department in August had said that it was going to phase out its relationships with private prisons after a recent audit by the government found that private facilities had more safety and security problems than ones run by the government. And this phasing out didn't include illegal immigrants at all. And then in September, the Department of Homeland Security said it would re-examine its use of private contractors to hold immigration detainees. And this plan to conduct a review of private immigration detention centers comes on the heels of a separate Department of Justice order, which was on August 18th, that would force the Bureau of Prisons to fully end its reliance on private prisons. And then when Trump was elected, the stock of Corrections Corporations of America rose by 30%, as well as its competitor GEO Group rose by 30%. So the bottom line was Obama had vowed to cut federal reliance on prison contractors, but Trump's immigration plans kind of mean new business for private prisons.
So two of the companies that you specifically talked about, Connor, CCA and GEO, those two corporations have actually had a few court cases brought against them in the last few years, more so than in previous of the last few years. So a lot of this information that I'm going to share with you is from the American Civil Liberties Union and the Reason Foundation. So the Supreme Court recently declared that private prison companies cannot be sued by inmates for constitutional violations, so meaning that people who work at those private prisons can technically not be held accountable for any constitutional violations, or the people who own the companies, not the actual inmates. Not the actual workers. The workers can in fact be held accountable. So inmates can still sue the individual officers, like I just said, but the court wouldn't extend that protection for the inmates to the actual corporation. An example of a case that has been brought about in the last 2 decades or so is Richardson versus McKnight. This was in 1997. So an inmate sued 2 guards at a prison in Tennessee that had been privatized and alleged that the guards had deprived him of a right secured by the Constitution. They alleged that the guards were liable to him under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. So the quote, this is a quote from the ACLU, government agents typically work with civil service rules that provide them some security and may limit the ability to punish individual employees. However, firms in the marketplace face pressures to encourage sound decision-making. Also, firms do not have to contend with civil service restrictions, thus they can use inducements like carrots and sticks to motivate employees. Thus, immunity would not provide the quality of decisions made by firm agents. So this is just an example that it hasn't been in solely recent years, but there's always kind of been those issues that have arisen with private prisons within the judicial system. Another example is a more recent one, 2011, Manisi versus Pollard. So an inmate, Richard Lee Pollard, at a federal prison run by the private company GEO, he slipped on a cart left in a doorway and injured both of his elbows. And when they were preparing to transport him, the employees, to an outside orthopedic clinic, he said they made him wear a jumpsuit, a black box wrist restraint, and despite him saying that it would be excruciatingly painful, they continued to do so. So Pollard sued GEO and its employees for allegedly violating his 8th Amendment, which is the protection against cruel and unusual punishment. So originally, his claims were dismissed by the Eastern District of California, a U.S. court, and the appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit concluded that the Supreme Court recognized an implied cause of action for injury. So they basically said that because the private prison and its employees operate under the color of federal law, that's a quote, the color of federal law, Pollard has a valid claim for Supreme Court precedent, or under Supreme Court precedent. Another example of cases that are similar, Dockery versus Epps in 2015, and Kelly versus Wangler. Dockery versus Epps is an example of a case where it's a class action suit, basically, that a Mississippi prison had such horrible conditions that it was actually a prison that was made for people with mental illness. It was mainly focused on them, that they were used and dealt with excessive force, that they were underfed, they were harmed. There were people who claimed gangrene, lost lives and limbs. So horrible conditions. That suit is technically still being, brought to a close. It's still being brought to a settlement. Kelly versus Wangler is a 2016 case, so that's literally this year. The Idaho Correctional Center, ICC, is apparently an extraordinarily violent prison. It is known in Idaho as Gladiator School for a reason, says the ACLU. More violence occurs at ICC than at Idaho's 8 other prisons combined. So these people brought a suit from the prison against the fact that they've been in a extremely violent space, and this is still being settled. So those are just some examples of cases that have been brought against, obviously concluding that these companies are privatized, but they're still being held accountable under constitutional law, but not the actual companies, just the people who work there. So that is something to consider.
So there's not a lot of empirical evidence in support of private prisons, but there are a couple of factors that are consistent throughout people who support it. So one major factor is the economic benefit of a city or a town or a community that hosts a private prison. So the example I saw most often in my research was Karnes County, Texas. And they had one prison facility built in 1998, and at the time the article was written, they're planning on having another one built. And the county experienced a lot of economic growth. There were more jobs, and the local businesses benefited because there were other people there. But on the flip side, there are also other towns like Hardin, Montana, that had a similar deal to Karnes County, but their prison was never filled. So, excuse me.
You good, Mark?
Perfect. So they were on the hook for a $27 million prison that they weren't able to fill, so they were never able to get those economic benefits. And some other methods that people subscribe to is they'll say that private prisons can be built cheaper than public, although there are conflicting reports on that. And also in an editorial written in the New York Times, a group of people point out the flaws in the Department of Justice report that said that private prisons were worse than public prisons. And they said that the private prisons picked were very homogeneous, gang-filled, and it's hard to compare because it's more like apples and oranges.
Well, you already briefed on the inception of private prisons. But even after all that time, New York University School of Law in 2015 found that since 2000, private prisons' effect on the crime rate of increasing incarcerations has been essentially zero. With that, just to give a little idea of the creators of private prisons, how they felt about this. Thomas W. Beasley, the former co-founder of the Corrections Corporation of America, once said that you just sell prisons like you're selling cars or real estate or hamburgers. One way for private prisons to minimize costs is by skimping on provisions, including food for both employees and the prisoners themselves. A psychiatrist who investigated a privately run prison in Mississippi found that the inmates were severely underfed and looked emaciated. During their incarceration, prisoners at this Mississippi penitentiary were found to have lost anywhere from 10 to 60 pounds. Another troubling fact is that 100% of all military helmets, ID bags, ID tags, bulletproof vests, canteens are all created in federal prison systems through prison labor. Although they may be generously compensated per hour for their work, this exploited labor force is obviously very critical to the military-industrial complex, and taking that out of private prisons is going to be difficult. So we talked about how states can have to sign agreements with private prisons in order. They have these occupancy clauses that talk about how they will guarantee space. Since they are obliged to do so, they are obliged to keep prisons at almost full capacity at all times, or typically 90%. This happened recently where the quota wasn't met, and a multi-million-dollar fine was forced upon the state taxpayers. Longer mandatory minimum sentences are also keep inmates in longer, and these kind of contracts are seen as not promoting rehabilitation, reducing crime, or building communities, but rather just to incentivize criminalization. Another troubling fact that I found was that the three largest for-profit prison corporations have spent more than $45 million on campaign donations and lobbyists so far, just to privatize incarceration, which is a true testament to how money drives everything. In Florida, officials found that 2 private prisons spend only about half as much on health care per inmate as comparable state prisons in the state, which amounted to a difference of $9 million for health care over those 2 years. 5 of the 8 private prisons serving in Arizona did not accept inmates with limited physical capacity or stamina, or severe physical illnesses or chronic conditions, according to the state's analysis. None of the private prisons took inmates with high-need mental health conditions. This is just another one of the negatives, how private prisons really do cherry-pick their inmates and force the more expensive upon the state. When inmates do become sick, they are returned to state prisons due to an increase of their medical scores. Another big issue deeply attached to private prisons would be the interstate transfer of prisons through the practice of using private corporations for that. Right now, there are around over 10,000 state prisoners currently incarcerated out of their home states, on average 450 miles away from their own homes. This could take away from, it usually has negative consequences because it takes them away from their family and their support systems. It's not great to put them in a outside area. And yeah, just overall, a huge negativity is that it really does seem to focus on money, but it's not run with safety or efficiency or the treatment of the prisoners in mind.
I can see that from both sides. I feel like there's not a lot of empirical data, like actual statistical data from both sides, which makes it a little bit difficult to weigh them on like a this versus this basis.
I agree. There's a lot of opinion involved. I believe.
Like neither side addresses the other side's information or statistics and stuff like that.
Especially in studies, because many studies have motives, so kind of affects the results.
Yeah, in the empirical data that we have looked at so far, it doesn't really seem like either side really wants to, give the other side's data merit.
Yeah.
Private prison industry partly funds one thing, and of course the public and the government are not going to view that, but the DOJ puts out a huge metadata, and of course, their administration's initiative is to shut down private prisons. So I'm not sure if you can, you really do need to get more independently funded and independently viewed, ideology-wise, in there to really pull them out.
And you want to believe the court cases that have been brought to these companies, like, okay, these are the conditions that they're being faced with, but at the same time, like, that same judicial system is the system that's outsourcing to these facilities, so why would they completely, like, I guess turn a suit against them, which is a good assumption as to why those corporations are not held accountable for those constitutional amendments and those constitutional rights that they, I guess, impede on for those inmates. You know what I mean? Like, that makes sense. So
yeah, I mean, it's easy to talk about the morality of that, but I think since, just with all the different industries that go on and are incorporated in the private prisons, it's really hard. It's not cut and dry to just be able to take them out, and
yeah,
it seems like they are connected in so many different areas that it's not very easy.
It's hard to sit there and say, like, okay, this is what we should and this is what we shouldn't do, simply because...
What are you going to do about what we're taking it away from?
Exactly. Yeah, there's, like, so many hands in the pot. There's so many people that have invested in it, and they're, like, all the lobbying you talked about. I
think even Connor brought up before about how it would even be hard to just shut down private prisons all on the own, and then what are you going to do with those kind of workers?
Right, you'd have to have some time to, like, transition out all those jobs, because that'd be taking a lot of jobs away from the private prison industry, and you'd have to put them somewhere. So
but then you'd have to think about the potential ability to have a private prison, like a company create a correctional facility that could essentially teach people a certain trade, and then those people would, but then I guess that's a gray area, because
that's definitely a gray area, because even we talked in class about how there are some prisons that prepare you for certain industries that felons can't take those jobs.
Yeah,
I believe the barber was one of them.
Yeah, I visited Sing Sing this past summer, and they train all their people to be barbers. And according to our class discussion, you can't be a barber. So
yeah,
I don't see the importance of that. Yeah,
then it's a complete.
It's got to be a little more streamlined, thought out.
Yeah. And it's hard because there's no data. So it's like you get yourself in this circle where you're like, well, the research is skewed, so what do we base it off of?
And it's hard to get research on that too. I mean, you got to look at like similar sizes of different levels of maximum security, even prison population size, like different states, like all the different taxes that go into it. Like it wouldn't even be that easy to create like good empirical. I don't know how you create good empirical data off of that. There's so many different variables that it's really hard to balance the options.
Yeah, I feel like I know private prisons exist elsewhere in the world, but I feel like even from there's not a lot of like data on them. Like I know Canada had 2, and then they ended up like receding into the government. You know what I mean? The government took them back over. So, I mean, it's not like it's almost like there hasn't been this long-standing successful private prison anywhere. Like there's not an example that people talk about. So how successful can they really be if there's not a prime example?
Over in Australia, this is the utopia. Like this is what we should all build it off of. There's no utopia.
Yeah, because I
know the UK even tried using private prisons. They might have used it before us, and I don't think that they have a great to show everyone.
And statistically, from what it's like, they're underinsured. They're the conditions are worse, and the only positive that comes out of it is that it could potentially cost less.
Yeah, and the cost difference is not enough to justify all the human rights violations we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, that are apparent in not only the against, but in the court cases that have been brought forward. But we still can't for sure go off of all of that. So
it's hard to weigh money and medical care, or how you're going to be treated by these unexperienced COs, and I don't know.
That's true too.
Really
the
hard.
Inexperience of the workers in the prisons too is a big thing. I mean, in conclusion, I feel like that would just mean that we would just say that private prisons probably aren't even a good idea for the U.S.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah, I had a different view coming into this, but after we're talking it out at the table, I think it would be too hard to just place these heavy restrictions on it, and trying to overregulate and overstructure it. I think that would just be impossible.
especially if you were trying to outsource all of the regulations that you would have to make and all of those rules. And everybody works differently. Each state works differently, and to bring it to a federal level takes it away from the state rights, which people would have a problem with. I mean, just the ability for all of it to work out.
But even like the cost, like when you do cost analysis of the cost benefit analysis between private and public, I mean, I don't really think it's even taking into account like half of the hidden costs. For instance, like the transportation. I said that like. The average prisoner is put between 450 and like almost 3,000 miles away from their house. On average, I'm pretty sure a federal prisoner, I believe most private prison transports cost $1.50 per mile to transfer those people. So I mean, just do the math. I mean, they're already trying to, save money by doing court visits via webcams. They don't have to be driving these people back and forth with, armed transport to and from court to jail. These people are just being transferred to jail.
Yeah.
That's just one of the examples of an unnecessary cost.
And I feel like, honestly, in conclusion, I think that if we were to say that private prisons aren't a good idea, the biggest thing that I could think of is the fact that private prisons are in it for money. And
Where's the
there's no morality in that, and the United States is a government for its people, and our judicial system is a part of the government, so therefore it's for the people. So even though prisons may, that are run by the government and are run by, the states and federal government, whatever it is, even though they may not be the best and recidivism isn't the best right now, I wouldn't say that is a huge disparity topic between private and public prisons. And I think that just the simple fact that they are for the government, they are from the government, so they're supposed to help the people, already puts them in a position that is more likely to do better for society than a private prison.
Yeah, when you make it about money and make it so, having more prisoners, makes you more money, that's just starting off bad. I mean, because then there's never, I'm not, if I'm running it, I would never want to have, no one in my prison. I would want everyone to be breaking the law because I want the money. That's just how capitalism works. But I don't think
we should limit
people's lives.
We should limit the capitalism to a certain, and this is where it should be limited, is in fixing our nation. We shouldn't, and you're exactly right. Like, we shouldn't put a price on morality.
Money's important, but America has shown that, respecting human rights and respecting common man is definitely more important than that. So.
Any other concluding thoughts? Nope.
I think we hit all of it.
All right.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.